So now that you get the big picture of why you are breaking down these macronutrients, I want to look at the specific macronutrients and how they're broken down, how they're absorbed, how they're used in the body. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at carbohydrates, and this is the breakdown of carbohydrates, but that's not the only thing you can do with carbohydrates. And then we're going to look at fats, lipids, and then we're going to look at proteins. But this video is specifically going to be looking at carbs. Okay, so first thing is carbs need to be broken down. So if, for instance, you eat a starch like in a French fry or a potato, what is going to happen is you are going to have to break down that carbohydrate. So this complicated picture is showing you the 3 different macromolecules. So carbs, amino acids, and then these are the fatty acids. But let's just concentrate on one of them for a second. And let's say, okay, so what do we do with carbs? Well, first off, carbohydrates need to be broken down to disaccharides and monosaccharides before they can actually be absorbed, okay? So let's talk about how that occurs briefly. So complex dietary carbohydrates like starches in the things that you eat are broken down by these enzymes called amylases. And amylase, you've got salivary amylase, which is part of the reason that you start salivating when, for instance, you smell chocolate chip cookies. It breaks down big complex carbohydrates into smaller carbohydrates. You've also got pancreatic amylase, which does the same thing, kind of. And it breaks them down into things that are small enough to absorb, okay? And then what about the whole absorption mechanism? So how do you absorb carbohydrates in the gut? So if we go all the way back and talk about, okay, so now we are going to absorb carbohydrates into the gut. So this is a small intestine, a villus, and then microvilli. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are generally going to be absorbed straight into the bloodstream, not the lymphatic system. And we're going to concentrate on glucose. Now, the absorption mechanism we'll talk about in the next set of notes in more detail. It's called secondary active transport, but don't worry about it for right now. I'll just refer back to it in the next set of notes and put it back together with what we're talking about. Okay, so now, after you get them in, what happens to them? What happens to a carbohydrate after you have absorbed it? What happens after you have absorbed it is you can break it down to make ATP via glycolysis, and then if you've got oxygen, you can go into Krebs and oxphos, right? And then if you have extra, you can actually store it as a big complex carb called glycogen, which you primarily store in your liver and your skeletal muscle. But then if you still have more, so if instead of eating 2 chocolate chip cookies, you ate 4, you store it. But what if you just went over the wall and ate the whole pan yourself? Then after you've stored all you could as glycogen, one of the things we'll talk about is that you can store it as fatty acids, okay? So now let's talk about how you get carbohydrate into most of your body cells. So when it moves into a cell, it usually needs a transport protein called a carrier, and it moves in via facilitated diffusion. And many cells, but not all of them, actually need insulin's permission to move glucose in. So we will revisit the whole facilitated diffusion and insulin's role in glucose transport multiple times this semester. It's just the first time that I'm going to tell you that many cells, but not all, require insulin to move glucose into the cell. And once you get it in, you can do the catabolic processes, right? You can do cellular respiration with it, but not if you can't get it in. And that matters for a diabetic, okay? So once you get it in, you kind of know the story. You can break it down to pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And then if you've got oxygen, you can continue the breakdown to get 36 to 38 ATPs per molecule of glucose. Revisiting this question, just to make sure you get used to the terminology, this whole process of breaking down glucose or any other carbohydrate, is that anabolic or catabolic? What do you think? breaking down glucose to carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Is that anabolic or catabolic? It is catabolic. Okay? All right, so glucose is very, very special because it's special to the brain. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the brain is super duper specific about what macronutrients it can burn. It really, really, really prefers glucose above all other things. We will see when we get into fatty acids that there are some ways that you can force it to burn fat. It will be pissed, but you can force it to do that. But pretty much the brain really prefers glucose above and beyond all things, which means that there better be a mechanism for storing glucose when I have excess and making withdrawals when times are tough, okay? And the methods for excess glucose storage and retrieval and the alternate production of glucose. So there's basically something that you're going to have to learn, and you're going to use it all semester long. And that is this whole thing right here, okay? And I'm going to explain it to you, and then we can redraw it. You will probably want to draw it for yourself. So here's the deal. Here's our favorite molecule, which is glucose, which is the brain's preferred molecule. And the brain is the favorite organ of the brain. So it makes sure that it's always supplied with adequate amounts of glucose. And remember, it doesn't store for a rainy day, so it needs the rest of the body to store for it. So let's look at the things that happen when you have excess and when you're low. And let's try to, instead of memorizing the words that look really similar to one another, glycolysis you already know, but look at all of these other words, glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, gluconeogenesis, those all look really similar to one another. So if you just try to rote memorize them, you're going to have a bit of a hard time. But if you try to understand them, and I've color-coded them for you, you'll have a bit of an easier time. So let's look at what happens when I have, okay, so first let's look at glycolysis and make sure we remember that. Taking glucose and breaking it down ultimately to ATP and pyruvate, and then you're going to burn the rest of that and eventually make carbon dioxide and water. But taking glucose and breaking it down is, of course, what you are going to do if you are the brain and if you're any organ. And this process is called glycolysis, right? Glycolysis. And notice glyco, which means sugar, and you see that prefix or one similar to it repeated 3 times, okay? So the breakdown of sugar is glycolysis, okay? And really that's where we need to get if we are the brain or another organ that wants to burn it down. But we're going to have the ability to store it when we've got excess and to retrieve it when times are tough. So now what we are going to have to do is look at some other things. So first, let's look at glycogenesis. Okay, so let's talk about glycogenesis just a little bit. Okay, so glycogenesis is what we're looking at right here. Glyco as in sugar and genesis as in beginning. This is the synthesis of glycogen, which is how animals, and you are an animal, how animals store glucose. So when I take glucose, yes, and I move it and store it as glycogen, moving that direction, that is glycogenesis. Glycogen is a big complex carbohydrate. It's made up of hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules, but very importantly, this process is reversible. It can go both directions. But glycogenesis is just going from glucose this direction to glycogen storage. Okay, so where do I store it? The primary sites of glycogen storage are in skeletal muscle and in liver. Your glycogen stores, depending on how much carbo loading you've done and how much you are wiggling, your glycogen stores can last you a few hours. Logic question for you. Is glycogenesis, this product this thing that we're looking at right here, is that anabolic or catabolic? Glycogenesis. So is glycogenesis anabolic or catabolic? And that's what I'm asking you guys right here. So what do you think? Anabolic or catabolic? So I'm taking glucose, which is relatively small, and storing it as glycogen, which is a bit larger. So glycogenesis is anabolic. Yeah, that's an anabolic process. And I will do that when I've got plenty of glucose. Okay, but that process wouldn't do me a darn bit of good if I couldn't reverse it when I actually needed that sugar. So the process of reversing it, so let's look here, is this word. So let's look at it and then we'll go back to the diagram up there. That process is called glycogen. Notice the word glycogen, not just glyco. Glycogenolysis. So this is the breakdown of glycogen, okay? And this happens in liver and skeletal muscle. So it's taking glycogen and it's breaking it back down to glucose. So this would be like making a deposit into your savings account, and this is like making withdrawal from your savings account. Glycogenolysis. So you've got lysis. Lysis of what? Lysis of glycogen. Breaking glycogen down to what? Breaking it down to glucose. Cool? Okay, so the breakdown of glycogen back to glucose, and then you can burn glucose if you want to via glycolysis or whatever you want to do. So importantly, when the liver does this, it can dump the glucose into the bloodstream so that the brain can use it. So the liver stores it, dumps it back into the bloodstream, stores it, dumps it back into the bloodstream. Skeletal muscles do not share with any other cells. The skeletal muscles share, think of its glycogen as like a piggy bank, not a savings account. So the liver is the savings account for the whole body, including the brain, but the skeletal muscle doesn't share, okay? So it stores it and uses it and stores it and uses it for itself. Okay, so question, is glycogenolysis, this process that we're looking at right here, from glycogen to glucose, is that anabolic or catabolic? What do you think? Taking glycogen and breaking it down to glucose. That is a catabolic process. And then you can use the glucose via another catabolic process to ultimately break it down to ATP. Okay, now, and we'll talk about this more. After your glycogen stores are completely full, like if time was really, really good, and you stored all of your glycogen, you could also do what's called lipogenesis, which is store the rest of it as fat after you fill up your glycogen stores. Okay, and then the last term, and then we'll stop here, is gluconeogenesis, okay? So low carb diet or fasting conditions. So what do you do if, for instance, you haven't eaten, so you don't have any glucose in your bloodstream? It's been hours, so you've used up all of your glycogen stores, but you're still hungry. Your brain still needs glucose because your brain never stops needing glucose even when you're sleeping. Do you just say, oh, it was a good run and just die? No, obviously you don't, because we have all lived through fasting, whether it was fasting for religious or cultural reasons, or fasting because you had to go to the doctor and they didn't have an appointment until 11 and then didn't get you in until 1, or you're doing intermittent fasting or whatever. But you've done it before and you know that you're probably not going to die from doing it. So what do you do in a pinch? You have this other, this is like plan C. Plan A would be to have enough. Plan B would be to use your stored stuff. Plan C is I'm completely out. Then what do? You start burning amino acids. And amino acids you could have gotten from your diet, but sometimes if you haven't eaten glucose, you haven't eaten amino acids either. Amino acids are from protein. So then you can start breaking down amino acids. You can either break down the amino acids that are in your bloodstream if you still got some in your bloodstream, or you can start eating yourself. So you can break down your amino acids from your skeletal muscle, and you do gluco, which is sugar, neo, which is new, and genesis, the beginning of new sugar. Okay, so what you're doing is you're taking an amino acid and you're making it into glucose. Why not just burn the amino acid? Well, some cells can, but brain cells can't. So brain cells will require, and the liver, by the way, does this for them, that you take an amino acid and you make it into glucose, and then you send the glucose to the brain so that the brain can use the glucose. And this process is called gluconeogenesis. So one last time looking at the terminology, and then we're done with this. So glycolysis is breaking down glucose to form ATP, other byproducts as well. All cells are going to do glycolysis. When you have excess glucose and you want to store it as glycogen, that process is glycogenesis, right? Storing glycogen. So it's really got both roots. It's got glycogen and genesis, glycogenesis, but don't put the other gen in there. Glycogenesis. But then once you run out of glucose that's just circulating in your bloodstream, you're going to have to do glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis is how you pronounce it. And it takes glycogen and it makes it back into glucose. So again, you can burn it. And then if you run out of glucose and you run out of stored glycogen, what do? Plan C is to take amino acids from wherever you can get them and do gluconeogenesis, the beginning of new glucose, right? And you make glucose, which then you can burn. Okay, we are going to be using these terms all semester long, so go ahead and get comfortable with them. On a multiple choice question, I would put all of them as choices, so you need to be able to distinguish them from one another, which is why I color coded them for you. Okay.